The Bible was the last place anyone in Ashvere House expected to find a scandal. It sat on the writing table in Her Grace's private sitting room, a thick and sober volume bound in black calfskin, with gilt lettering worn smooth by the pressure of many gloved hands. The late Duchess had kept it there for 20 years. Her daughter-in-law had kept it there for 3 more. And if you asked any member of the household staff what the book contained, they would have told you it contained the book of Genesis and the consolations of Psalms, and a faded violet pressed between Ezekiel and Daniel that no one dared remove. No one would have told you it contained a letter. No one knew. No one, until the morning of the 14th of November, 1819, when Nora Vane reached inside to dust the back of the table, and the Bible slid from its rest and fell open, and the letter fell out. She did not read it at first. That was important. Later, when the whole of Ashvere House wished very much that she had not read it at all, she bent and retrieved both the letter and the Bible, and she set the Bible back on the table with the careful precision that 6 years of service had worn into her hands, and she saw the letter was sealed with a crest she did not immediately recognize, and she saw that the address on the outer leaf read, "In a hand that was not Her Grace's, for Her Grace the Duchess of Ashvere, most private, destroy after reading." She saw all of that. And then she heard the footstep in the corridor, and she did what she should have done immediately. She set the letter back inside the Bible at the place it had fallen from, and she went on with her dusting. And she told herself she had not seen a thing. She was 19 years old, and she knew, without having been told in so many words, that a maid who saw things was a maid who would soon be given a character reference and a coach ticket, and not asked to return. She had seen it all the same. That was the problem. She had seen enough. The crest on the letter's seal belonged to the Duke of Ashvere and the Duchess, who had been dead for 4 months. If you found your way here by something more than chance, then you already feel what is waiting in this story. Stay with it. Nora Vane had not come to Ashvere House under any illusion. She had come because her mother's lungs were giving out in a cottage in Dorset, and the wage was good, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Payne, was known in the county for running a clean establishment where girls were not preyed upon. She had come with 2 dresses, a good pair of leather shoes, and an education far exceeding her station, the latter courtesy of a village schoolmaster who had noticed that she could read at 4 years old and had not quite been able to leave the fact alone. She could write a fair hand. She knew her French. She had read enough history to know that the English aristocracy had been making terrible decisions since at least the 14th century and showed little sign of improvement. She was, in the language the season used for women like her, a nobody, the daughter of a wheelwright, in service, £20 a year and her keep. What she was not, and had never been, was stupid. Ashvere House in the autumn of 1819 was a house under a particular kind of strain. The Duke had been in residence for 6 weeks, which was unusual. He was more often in London, or so said the under-butler, Cradwick, who had opinions about everything and kept them circulating through the servants' hall like weather. His Grace had come to Wiltshire immediately after the Duchess's funeral in July, and had not gone back to London, and the house had arranged itself around his presence the way a house arranges itself around a fire that might at any moment go out. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He was 34 years old, and he had been married at 26 and widowed at 33. And whatever the marriage had been, it had left him with a face that kept everything behind it, and a habit of standing at the library window for long periods without apparently looking at anything. His name was Edmund Calder, Duke of Ashvere. His hair was dark and beginning at the temples, to carry the first silver of a man who had thought too hard for too long. His eyes were the color of winter river water, neither quite blue nor gray, and they noticed things. That was what Nora had learned about him in 6 weeks. His eyes noticed things, and the rest of his face did not tell you what they had found. She had spoken to him 4 times. The first time, she had been crossing the upper hall with a stack of linens, and he had appeared from the direction of the portrait gallery and said, without particular warmth, "You are the new maid." And she had said, "Yes, Your Grace." And he had said nothing further and passed on. The second time, he had come into the sitting room while she was airing it, and had stood for a long moment looking at the empty chair by the window where the Duchess had sat, and Nora had kept her eyes on her work and tried to be absent without leaving the room. The third time, he had asked her to carry a note to Mrs. Payne, and when she had returned to tell him Mrs. Payne was in the still room and would come directly. He had looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded as though he had not used it in some days. The fourth time was the morning after she found the letter, and that occasion was different from all the others. The letter sat in the Bible for 3 days. She could not leave it alone, not in her mind. She went about her work with her usual competence, and she answered Mrs. Payne's questions with her usual economy, and she slept badly each night with the image of that crest pressing itself against the inside of her eyelids. The Duke's crest. On a letter addressed to the Duchess, marked "Destroy" after reading. Not destroyed. There were explanations that were innocent. She turned them over like coins. A letter from a solicitor, perhaps, sent in the Duke's name on estate business. A letter forwarded through his office on some domestic matter. A letter of condolence from a relation. She examined each of these explanations carefully, and she could not make them fit the instruction that had not been followed. Destroy after reading. Those were not words a solicitor put on a letter about drainage matters or coal deliveries. Those were not words anyone put on a letter, unless the letter contained something that could not survive daylight. On the third day, Lady Eugenia Calder arrived. She was the Duke's mother, a woman of 62, who had been the reigning force of Ashvere House for 20 years before her son's marriage, and had spent the 3 years of that marriage performing a graceful retirement that had fooled no one. She was small and extraordinarily upright, with pale eyes that moved over a room the way a magistrate's eyes move over a courtroom, missing nothing and forgiving very little. She wore gray and cream in alternating morning and half-mourning as occasion required. She had, in Nora's limited experience of her, the particular manner of a woman who had been told all her life that she was formidable, and had eventually decided they were right. Lady Eugenia's arrival filled the house with a different quality of air. The staff moved more quietly. Cradwick stopped offering his opinions in the servants' hall. Mrs. Payne inspected the state of the silver with a thoroughness that had not been seen since the previous Christmas. Nora cleaned the sitting room with extra care and thought about the letter. On the fourth day, she made her decision. Not a decision to act exactly, but a decision to stop pretending she had not seen what she had seen. The letter was addressed to the Duchess. The Duchess was dead. The letter had not been destroyed. Someone had placed it in a Bible on a writing table in a private room, hidden well enough that it had not been found in the month since the Duchess died, which meant the Duchess herself had hidden it there, which meant she had read it and not destroyed it, which meant she had kept it for a reason. Nora went to the sitting room in the early afternoon when the household was occupied with Lady Eugenia's settling-in arrangements. She did not tell herself she had a right to read the letter. She knew perfectly well she did not. She told herself only that the letter existed and that it was sitting inside a Bible in a room she was employed to clean, and that if anyone was going to cause harm to the household she served, she would rather know the shape of it. She opened the Bible at the place she had marked in her memory. She read it in 2 minutes. It was not a long letter. Her hands were very steady. She was rather proud of them. Then she set the letter back and closed the Bible and stood with her hands flat on the calfskin cover and thought one thing only. Well then, the letter was from Edmund Calder, Duke of Ashfire, written 6 months before the Duchess's death, in April of 1819. It concerned a meeting at an address in Bath that Nora recognized as a solicitor's chambers. It concerned a document, unnamed, that had been signed by both the Duke and by a third party, whose name Nora also recognized. Lord Carow, the Duchess's brother. It concerned the settlement of a debt of £12,000, and it contained at the close 3 sentences that made the first 2 paragraphs into something else entirely. She kept this herself because she intended to use it. That is all I can tell you, in conscience. Whatever she told you of me was not all of the truth. Nora did not know what document. She did not know what debt. She did not know what the Duchess had told anyone. Or about what. She knew only that a man had written those 3 sentences to his wife, and that his wife had hidden them in a Bible, and that the man was now 34 years old and living in the house where his wife had died, and that his mother had just arrived. She replaced the letter and went to empty the grates. It was Lady Eugenia who found her at it. Lady Eugenia had developed, in 62 years of living in great houses, an unerring instinct for rooms where something was not quite right. And she walked into the sitting room at 3:20 in the afternoon with the decisive step of a woman who had already decided she was needed there. She looked at Nora kneeling at the grate. She looked at the writing table. She looked at Nora again. "You are vain," she said. "Mrs. Payne speaks well of you." "Your ladyship is very kind," Nora said, and kept her eyes on the grate. "Stop that and stand up. I want to speak with you." Nora stood. She was not, she discovered in this moment, afraid of Lady Eugenia, in the way she had expected to be. There was something clarifying about a woman who simply spoke the thing she intended to speak. You always knew where you were. "You clean this room daily." "Yes, your ladyship." "The writing table. Has anything been disturbed on it since the Duchess's death?" Nora looked at the writing table. She looked at the Bible. She looked at Lady Eugenia, whose pale eyes were very steady. "Not to my knowledge," Nora said. "Your ladyship." It was the first time she had lied outright, and she noted the experience carefully. Her hands had not shaken. Lady Eugenia looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Very well," in a tone that meant something other than very well, and withdrew. Nora went back to the grate. She thought it plainly. Someone knows. The question she had not yet answered was whether that someone was trying to protect the Duke or destroy him. Lord Carow arrived the following morning. He was the late Duchess's brother, 45 years old, with a florid face that had once been handsome, and a manner that had once been charming, and neither of which was wearing especially well. He arrived in a curricle that had been repainted once too many times, and he greeted the Duke in the entrance hall with the particular warmth of a man who believes he holds something over you and is not yet ready to say so. Nora saw them from the upper landing. She had not meant to be there. She was carrying towels, and she had simply not yet descended. She watched Lord Carow clasp the Duke's hand and say, in a voice that carried, "You look well, Edmund, considering." The Duke said nothing in response to the considering. He said, "You are welcome, Carow," in the way a man says a thing that is formally true, without being in any other sense accurate. She descended the servant's stair and told herself it was not her concern. It became her concern that evening. She was in the passage behind the dining room, replacing a candle in the wall sconce, when she heard Lord Carrow's voice from within. The dining room was not quite closed, and Lord Carrow was not being careful, and what she heard made her stand very still with the spent candle in her hand, and think, very clearly. There it is. She did not catch every word. She caught enough. She caught the word document and the words my sister knew it, and the phrase your position in the Lord's and the question, delivered in the tone of a man who already knows the answer. What would the committees say? She caught the Duke's response. That document is long destroyed. And Lord Carrow's reply. Are you entirely certain, Edmund? She replaced the candle and returned to the servants' hall and ate her supper, and said nothing. She said nothing the following morning, when the household was heavy with the strain of Lord Carrow's visit. She said nothing when Mrs. Payne remarked at breakfast that Lord Carrow was staying through the week. She said nothing all day, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency that was her principal protection. And she cleaned the sitting room in the early afternoon, and stood for a moment with her hand flat on the Bible's cover, and she thought, it is not destroyed. She found it. She kept it. And she kept it in here. The question she had been turning over for 4 days now resolved itself into something simpler. The Duchess had read the letter, and not destroyed it. Not because she had forgotten, because she had intended it to survive. For whom? That evening, the Duke came to the sitting room. She was there when he arrived, later than she should have been, replacing the last of the candles and setting the fire screen properly. The tasks she had told herself needed doing, and which had in truth been a reason to stay near the writing table. He entered without a lamp of his own, having come from the portrait gallery, and he stopped when he saw her. Vane, he said. It was not quite a question. Your Grace. I am just finished. She did not move toward the door. He looked at the writing table. He looked at the Bible. He was 34 years old, and his face was very still, and his eyes were the color of winter water, and they were, at this moment, looking at the Bible with an expression Nora could read precisely because she had been watching his face for 6 weeks. He had not known it was there. He had not known. She understood in that moment the whole shape of it, the shape she had been assembling for 4 days out of a fallen Bible and a seal and 3 sentences and a florid man's voice through an almost closed door. She understood it, and she chose. Your Grace, she said, I wonder if I may speak plainly. The Duke turned to look at her. No man of his rank had ever been asked that by a housemaid, and she saw the slight adjustment it required of him, the recalibration of a face accustomed to maintaining distance. Speak then, he said. She told him. Not at length, and not with embellishment. She had no gift for those, and this was not a moment that wanted them. She told him the Bible had fallen. She told him she had read the letter. She told him she knew where it was. She told him that Lord Carrow had come, and that she had heard what she had heard through the dining-room door. She did not tell him she was sorry for reading the letter, because that was the kind of thing people said when they had done something they would do again, and wanted to be forgiven for it anyway. And Nora was not a person who said those things. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, You understand what you were telling me. Yes, Your Grace. You understand what position it puts me in that you know. Yes, Your Grace. He was quiet for a moment. The fire had settled, and the room was warm and very still, and Nora stood with her hands at her sides and waited, because the decision was entirely his, and she had said everything she had to say. Why did you not go to Lady Eugenia? He asked. She spoke to you. I was not certain who she was trying to protect. Something moved in his face. It was not quite an expression, but it was the ancestor of one. That is a perceptive distinction, he said. The letter says the Duchess had information she intended to use, Nora said. She kept it hidden for a reason. Lord Caro believes it still exists and is trying to find it. If your mother knows where it is, and she is protecting you, she would have found a way to remove it before he arrived. She has not. That means she does not know it is there, which means she did not put it there, which means the Duchess hid it herself, which means the question of what to do with it has not been answered by anyone. He looked at her. You have thought about this at considerable length. I have had 4 days, she said. Your Grace. There was a pause that was different from the pauses that had preceded it. Then he crossed the room, not toward her, but toward the writing table. He opened the Bible at the place she had indicated. He stood for a long moment reading the letter he had written in April, 6 months before his wife died, and his face in the firelight was not a face she could read anymore. It had become the face he wore in public, the face that kept everything behind it. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. Your name, he said, not turning, is Nora. Yes, Your Grace. How old are you? 19, Your Grace. How long have you been in service? 6 years, Your Grace. I came as a child. He turned then. He looked at her in the firelight, and the expression on his face was not one she had seen there before. It was a kind of careful attention, the attention of a man who is recalculating. Where are you from? He said. Dorset, Your Grace. A village called Wincombe. Your father? A wheelwright, Your Grace. He died when I was 9. Your mother? Still living, Your Grace. She is not well. He was quiet again. The fire crackled, and the room held its warmth, and Nora stood very still and thought that he was deciding something, and that it was not only about the letter. I'm going to send for my solicitor in the morning, he said. Lord Caro's claim rests on a document that was supposed to have been destroyed. The letter you read confirms it was not destroyed, and that my wife was aware of it. That is a problem of law, not of household management, and it will be handled accordingly. You will not be asked to testify to anything. You will not be asked to involve yourself further. I understand, Your Grace, but I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. She waited. When you heard what you heard through the dining room door, he said, did you understand what Lord Caro is threatening? She considered the question with the care it deserved. He has a document, or he believes he has access to one, that concerns your conduct in some matter of politics or law that would damage your standing in the Lords. He is using his sister's knowledge of it, or his belief that she knew of it, to imply that the evidence survived her. He wants something from you in exchange for keeping that quiet. I do not know what he wants, Your Grace. I do not know what the document contains. The Duke looked at her for a very long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was, it concerns a vote 3 years ago that I was persuaded to give against my conscience in exchange for the cancellation of a debt I did not fully understand I had inherited from my father. I was 21 when my father died. I did not know the full extent of what he owed, or to whom. Lord Caro knew. He used that knowledge at a moment when I could not afford to refuse him. Nora held herself very still. He has been holding it since, the Duke said, and when his sister died, he decided that her death was an opportunity to revisit his terms. He believes the letter proves the arrangement was consensual, Nora said slowly, because you wrote to inform her of it. Yes. You wrote to tell her because she had heard something independently, and you did not want her to hear a version of it that was worse than the truth. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Yes. And whatever she told Lord Caro was her own version. She told him nothing directly, he said. I believe she told him nothing. I do not think she was his ally. She knew, however, and she was his sister. And he believes that what a man tells his wife will find its way to her family eventually, and he has been waiting for an angle since July. Nora thought of the 3 sentences at the end of the letter. She kept this herself because she intended to use it. That is all I can tell you, in conscience. Whatever she told you of me was not all of the truth. He had written those words 6 months before she died. He had not known she would hide the letter in a Bible. What did she intend to use it for? Nora asked. She heard how bold the question was, and did not retract it. He was a long time answering. I do not know with certainty. We did not have a confiding marriage. We were not unkind to each other. We were strangers who had met a handful of times before the wedding and had spent 3 years learning that we would remain strangers. A pause. She was not a happy woman. I do not think I made her less happy than she came to me. I was not sufficient to make her more happy either. She might have intended to use it as a protection, Nora said, if you had ever wished to separate yourself from her. He turned his head slightly and looked at her with an expression she could not name. Yes, he said after a moment. That is what I think. Then she was not your enemy, Nora said. She was frightened. The fire settled. The candles burned. Outside the sitting room window, Wiltshire lay very dark and very quiet, and there was a smell of coming rain in the air that the window did not quite keep out. You are not what I expected, the Duke said. He was not, she thought, speaking to her particularly. He was speaking the way men sometimes speak when they are too tired to perform anything. No, Your Grace, she said. I expect I am not. He looked at her again, and this time the look lasted long enough that she felt it in the base of her throat and in the palms of her hands. She did not look away. She was 19 years old and in service, and she had read his private letter and heard his dining room conversation, and had just been told more of his history than his solicitor probably knew. And she stood very straight and met his eyes and did not pretend to be simpler than she was. When I speak to my solicitor tomorrow, he said, I will recommend that Mrs. Payne find you a position that is better suited to your capacities. Your Grace, I cannot afford to lose this position. I said better suited, he said, with a faint edge that was not unkindness. Not a dismissal. I mean a position in the library. Cradwick has been attempting to organize my late father's correspondence for 3 years and has produced nothing but stacks. Your hand is clear, and you can read, and if you are willing to attempt French documents, which I suspect you are, the work will take approximately 6 months, and pay accordingly. Nora looked at him. She was very careful not to let what she was feeling move across her face. Yes, Your Grace, she said. Thank you. Do not thank me. It is employment, not charity, and I am told I am exacting. He paused. I am told correctly. She almost smiled. She did not. He held the letter in his breast pocket, and he looked at her in the firelight. And he said, The name. Nora. Yes, Your Grace. It suits you, he said, and walked past her to the door, and was gone. The winter settled over Ashvere House with the particular finality of a Wiltshire winter that has made up its mind. The solicitor came and went, and whatever passed between him and the Duke resolved Lord Caro's claim in a manner that sent Lord Caro back to his overpainted curricle and his diminished prospects without anything he had come for. Lady Eugenia remained a week longer, and when she took her leave, she paused in the entrance hall and said to no one in particular, that she had found the staff very satisfactory, and that Mrs. Payne was to be commended, and Nora, standing with linens on the upper landing, as she had been when Lord Carow arrived, thought that the remark was perhaps not directed entirely at Mrs. Payne. The library was 3 times the size of the sitting room, and smelled of old leather and a distant wood fire, and the particular dusty quiet of books that have been read by people now dead. There were 16 boxes of the late Duke's correspondence, which had not been organized because the late Duke had been what Cradwick called a paper saver, meaning he had kept every letter he had ever received from anyone, including, apparently, the King's household in 1793, the contents of which were not relevant to anything that had happened in the intervening 26 years. There were also 3 boxes of what appeared to be miscellaneous deeds and bills of sale and maps of the estate in various stages of accuracy, and 2 boxes of what turned out to be seed catalogues. Nora began with the seed catalogues, not because they were important, but because organizing a thing from its edges inward gave you the measure of the task before you committed yourself to the middle. The Duke worked in the library every morning. He did not speak to her much during those mornings. He read, or he wrote, or he stood at the window for the intervals that she had come to recognize as his thinking intervals, which were not, she had decided, empty. He thought in the way that certain kinds of minds think, not by talking, but by assembling. He was, she had come to understand, a man who had been shaped by a particular sequence of losses and had arranged himself around them, the way a tree arranges itself around a wound, growing over rather than healing through. He had lost his father young and taken on a dukedom with debts he did not know about. He had made a marriage that was correct and not warm. He had been manipulated by a man he could not refuse. He had been widowed. He had come home to a house full of his father's papers and his wife's Bible. And he was 34 years old, and it was winter. And he stood at the window and thought. She did not feel sorry for him. He would not have wanted that, and besides, she was not given much to pity. It was a feeling she had never had the luxury of sustaining. What she felt for him was something more like recognition. Here was a person who had been required to be capable in circumstances that did not reward capability, and who had gone on being capable anyway, and who had no one to tell the cost to. She knew that particular way of living very well. One morning in January, he set down his pen and said, without looking up from what he had been reading, "You have the seed catalogues in chronological order." "Yes, Your Grace. By the date of the printing rather than the date of receipt, since your father appears to have kept some of them for years before he used them." He looked up then. "How can you tell when they were printed?" "The varieties listed. The catalogue from 1803 doesn't include the apricot cultivar that appears in all of them from 1806 onward, which means the apricot must have come to the estate between those years. I can ask Henwick if he knows the date." The Duke looked at her with an expression she had learned to read. It was the expression he wore when something had not been what he expected. "Ask Henwick," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He returned to his papers. Then, after a moment, "The boxes from the southwest corner, are those the bills of sale?" "Deeds and bills of sale mixed together, Your Grace. I was going to separate them by type before I sorted them by date, since the deeds are worth more to you organized by property than by year." He set his pen down entirely this time. He turned in his chair and looked at her with the full attention he usually reserved for things he was reading. "Yes," he said. "That is the right approach. Thank you, Your Grace. Do you always think problems through before you speak about them?" She considered this. "I try to, Your Grace. I have found that people are more willing to give you latitude if you come to them having already done the preliminary work." "That is a diplomatic answer," he said. For a thing that is actually a survival strategy. She met his eyes. Yes, Your Grace, she said. It is. The heat that rose in the room in that moment was not from the fireplace. She was organizing seed catalogs, and he was sitting in a leather chair with a pen in his hand, and there were 16 boxes of correspondence and 6 months of winter ahead of them, and the silence that settled after those last words was not an empty silence. It was a silence that knew itself. He returned to his papers. She returned to the catalogs. The fire burned, and the library was quiet, and outside the windows the Wiltshire fields lay under their first real snow of the year. February arrived. She had been in the library 3 months, and she had finished the seed catalogs and the miscellaneous maps and half the bills of sale, and she had learned that the current Duke's father had been a generous man with poor instincts who had paid too much for 2 parcels of Norfolk land that had never produced what he had hoped, and that the debt Lord Carow had used was not the only one, though it was the largest. She organized what she had found into a summary that she laid on the writing table one morning when she arrived, and the Duke had not yet come down. He read it standing up, still in his coat from the cold outside. He turned to the last page. He turned back to the first. He set it down and stood for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "To organize correspondence, Your Grace." "To see it," he said. "The whole of it at once, and then reduce it to something that can be acted on." She thought about the village schoolmaster in Wyncombe, who had given her history books when the other children were practicing their letters, and about the 6 years in service that had taught her that understanding the whole of a house was the only way to work in it safely. "Practice," she said. He looked at her. He had been looking at her differently since January, with an attention that was no longer simply the attention of a man recalibrating his assessment of a servant. And she had known it, and said nothing about it. Because it was not, in itself, a problem. It was the attention of a man who was not accustomed to finding a mind in the places where he had not expected one, and he was still learning where to put it. "Nora," he said. Just her name, the way he had said it in the sitting room in November. With the same quality of attention that made it feel like a decision. "Your Grace," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth, rather than what you think I want to hear." "Yes, Your Grace." "When you came to me in November," he said, "when you told me about the letter, you said you were not certain whether my mother was trying to protect me or to use what she knew. Did you ever determine which it was?" She thought about it. "I think she does not always know herself," she said. "She has spent 40 years in houses like this one, making decisions that were correct by the logic of those houses. Your protection and her management of your protection are not easily separated in her mind. I think they may be the same thing to her. I think she loves you, without knowing how to separate that from the question of what is best for the house." He was quiet for a moment. "That is very accurate," he said. "It took me 30 years to arrive at that. How did you get there in 3 months?" "I clean her rooms, Your Grace," Nora said. "I know how she arranges things." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the shape of one. It was the first time she had heard anything like it from him, and she felt it quite specifically in the region of her chest. "My father's papers," he said, looking at the summary she had made. "I have avoided them for 12 years. They are not as bad as you feared, Your Grace. The Norfolk land was a mistake, but it has been producing better. The estate as a whole is sound." He looked at her. "You are telling me my affairs are in order. I am telling you, the worst of your father's decisions turned out better than he had reason to hope," she said. "That is a different thing." Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way things change when a person has been holding something at a careful distance and has briefly, by accident, put it down. "Come and have tea," he said, "in the morning room. You have been standing since 8 o'clock. Your Grace, it would not be appropriate for me to take tea with you in the morning room. It would be somewhat irregular," he said, with the same quality of faint dryness she had heard in November. "I said come and have tea, Nora, not an invitation, a command." Her heart was doing something she was not going to describe even to herself. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. The morning room was smaller than the library, and warmer, with windows that looked south toward the garden and a hearth that had already been lit. He poured, which was not what a duke poured in an ordinary morning, and she sat in the chair he indicated and wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the snow still lying on the garden beds outside. "The letter," he said after a while. "You returned it to the Bible." "Yes, Your Grace." "And you did not keep any part of it for yourself, as a protection?" She looked at him. "No, Your Grace." "Why not?" She considered the question with the care it deserved. "Because a protection that requires you to have leverage over another person is not really a protection. It is a version of what Lord Carow was doing. And I did not want to be that." He held his cup and looked at her steadily. The morning room was quiet and warm, and outside the snow was beginning to melt at the edges of the stones, and the light was the thin, bright light of a February morning in the south of England. And Nora sat in a chair opposite the Duke of Ashfire, and drank tea, and was not afraid. "I think," he said, "that you may be the most honest person in this house." "That would say more about the house than about me, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment. "Edmund." She stilled. "Not here," he said. "Not now. I am not suggesting anything improper. I am telling you a name, in return for having told me something true." He paused. "You may choose what to do with it." She looked at the fire. She looked at the melting snow. She looked at the tea in her cup. "Edmund," she said quietly, testing the shape of it. He did not look away. "Yes," he said. They sat in the morning room for another quarter of an hour. They drank tea. They did not speak again of anything particular. But the silence between them was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say to one another. It was the silence of two people who have said, carefully, exactly what they intended. What followed was not fast. It was not supposed to be fast. He was a duke, and she was a maid. And the world they lived in was very good at making clear the distance between those two facts. And they both understood that. And neither of them was the sort of person to pretend to misunderstand it for convenience. What followed was instead the slow accumulation of mornings in the library, and the careful, incremental discovery of a mind, and the gradual recalibration of two people who had each, in their own way, stopped expecting to be seen. He spoke to his solicitor in March. He spoke to Lady Eugenia in April. Lady Eugenia said things that were brisk and correct, and acknowledged the irregularity thoroughly, and said several times that it was unprecedented, which was true. And Nora, who heard the account of this conversation second-hand from a thoroughly startled Mrs. Payne, thought that unprecedented was not the same as impossible, and that a woman who had spent 40 years making correct decisions had perhaps arrived at one here without entirely meaning to. The announcement was made in May, in London, at the beginning of the season, in a drawing room full of people who said things at dinner parties for the next several weeks, that the gossip columns repeated with varying degrees of accuracy. A wheelwright's daughter, a maid, a Bible even, somewhere in the story, though the details on that point were confused in the telling. What was true was this: A letter had fallen out of a Bible on a November morning, and a girl with careful hands had read it, and had carried what she read to the person who needed to know it. Not for leverage or protection or any advantage of her own, but because it was the right thing to do. And because she was not the sort of person who looked away from the shape of a thing when she had seen it clearly. She stood in the entrance hall on the morning of the 23rd of May, 1820, in a pale green gown that was not borrowed and was not plain and had not been retrimmed one too many times, and he came down the stairs with the silver beginning to show more decisively at his temples. And when he reached the bottom, he took her hand, her right hand that had been steady in November, and was steady still, and he held it without gloves between his. "Nora," he said. "Edmund," she said. They were, in the language the season would eventually adopt for them, after it had finished being scandalized, a love match. They were, in the language Nora herself would have used if anyone had asked her, which they generally did not. Two people who had each read the other's character at close range under pressure, and decided they could trust what they found. The Bible went to the library. She placed it herself on the shelf between a volume of sermons and a collection of classical verse, where it sat in the company of things that had survived being read and were the better for it. The letter Edmund had burned in March before the solicitor visit. In the morning room fire, in her presence, she had watched it go without ceremony. On a Sunday in the following November, 1 year from the morning the Bible had fallen, she carried the first of their correspondence to be preserved, not hidden, and placed it in the front cover of a new ledger she had bought in the village for the purpose. Not a letter to be destroyed. A letter to be kept. The snow had just begun outside the library window, and the fire was warm. And somewhere in the house a door opened and closed with the comfortable weight of a house that knows it is inhabited by people who intend to remain. She opened the ledger. She smoothed the letter flat. She closed the cover. She was 20 years old, and she was home. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. It is enough sometimes to be heard.